Rotterdam Harbour, 1662. A Dutch man-of-war rides at anchor in still grey water, her 60 guns silent behind closed ports, her crew assembled on deck in enforced silence. The ship is the Liefde, 800 tons of oak and iron and human sweat, home to 260 men for the past 11 months. A man stands stripped to the waist on the main deck. His wrists are bound together above his head with tarred rope. A second rope, heavier, coarser, the thickness of a man's forearm, runs from his bindings down to the waterline, under the hull, and up the far side to a block at the opposite yardarm. His feet are lashed to a 32-pound cannonball. He is not a pirate. He is an ordinary seaman in the Dutch Navy, the most powerful fleet on earth. His crime: striking a petty officer during an argument over rations. An officer reads the sentence aloud from a parchment. The Dutch word cuts across the silence like a blade. Keelhauling, keelhauling. 200 men stand in ranks on the main deck and watch. Nobody speaks. The ship's drummer begins a slow roll, and then they throw him in. Picture this. You hit the water and the cold shocks every nerve in your body alive at once. The cannonball drags your legs straight down and the rope bites into your wrists and your face goes under. For 1 second you can still see grey sky through the green surface. Then the hauling begins and you are pulled sideways, fast, hard, and your back hits the hull. And the hull is alive. Thousands of barnacles, acorn barnacles, Balanus balanoids, each one a small volcano of calcium carbonate with edges like shattered glass. They cover every inch of a wooden hull below the waterline in a crust 2 to 3 inches thick, and now they cover you. The rope hauls you across them, under the massive oak keel timber, through 12 feet of black water and living razor blades. Your skin peels away in ribbons. Salt water floods wounds that are still opening. You cannot scream because your mouth is full of the North Sea. And then, if you are still conscious, you surface on the far side. Grey daylight. The sound of your own blood in the water. The faces of your shipmates looking down. That is keel hauling. Not a pirate punishment. Not an outlaw's invention. A government punishment, administered by officers in uniform, witnessed by the assembled crew, and logged in official records alongside the date, the weather, and the noon position. For more than 2 centuries, it was policy. To understand keel hauling, you first have to understand a problem that no one on land ever had to solve. How do you enforce discipline inside a floating wooden world, 3,000 miles from the nearest courtroom, among men who did not choose to be there? A warship in the 17th century was a closed society, arguably the most extreme closed society human beings have ever built. 200, sometimes 300 men crammed into a space smaller than a modern apartment building, for months or years at a time. No police, no judges, no right of appeal, no walking away. The captain's word was the only law, and his authority rested on a single, fragile foundation. The crew's belief that disobedience would be punished swiftly, publicly, and painfully enough to make the example stick. Lose that belief, and you lost the ship. This was not theoretical. Mutiny was the permanent nightmare of every naval officer in the age of sail. Ships that went soft on discipline did not just lose efficiency, they lost control entirely. The annals of the Dutch, British, and French navies are filled with mutinies that began with small acts of defiance left unpunished. A refused order, a curse muttered within earshot, a shove on the gun deck. If the response was weak, the next defiance was louder. So, every navy in the age of sail developed its own pyramid of violence. At the bottom, loss of rations, extra watches, time in irons below deck. In the middle, flogging, the cato, 9 tails, the workhorse of naval discipline, capable of delivering anywhere from a dozen to several hundred lashes, depending on the offence and the captain's temperament. And at the top, reserved for the most serious offences short of those warranting death, Keel hauling. Keel hauling occupied a unique position in that pyramid. It was not technically a death sentence. The codes that authorized it treated it as a severe corporal punishment, something a man could, in theory, survive and return to duty after. The fact that survival was not guaranteed, that a significant percentage of keel-hauled men drowned, bled to death, or died of infection in the days that followed, was understood by everyone involved, from the admirals who wrote the codes to the boatswains who tied the ropes. It was designed to be survivable. That survival was uncertain was considered a feature, not a flaw. The word itself is Dutch, keelhalen, literally, to drag along the keel. And it was the Dutch who owned this punishment. The article brief of 1629, the formal code of Dutch naval ordinances, the legal backbone of the most powerful fleet in the world, listed keel hauling as a specified punishment for a defined set of offences: striking a superior officer, drawing a weapon aboard ship, repeated insubordination, theft from the ship's stores. This was not improvised cruelty. This was statute law, debated by jurists, approved by the States General, printed and distributed to every captain in the fleet. Consider what that means. Somewhere in The Hague, in a panelled chamber with leaded windows and a tiled floor, men in black robes sat around a table and discussed the proper method for dragging a human being under the keel of a warship. They debated the appropriate offences. They specified the number of passes. They wrote it down in neat columns of printed Dutch and sent it to sea with the authority of the state behind it. Keel hauling was not born on a blood-soaked deck in a moment of rage. It was born in a committee room, in peacetime, by men who went home to their families afterward. The Dutch Republic in the mid-17th century was, by any measure, a superpower at sea. Under admirals like Michiel de Ruyter, arguably the greatest naval commander of the century, and Cornelis Tromp, the Dutch fleet fought the English across 3 Anglo-Dutch wars, challenged Louis XIV's France, and projected power from the North Sea to the Spice Islands. The ships were large, 60, 70, 80 guns, and the crews were enormous, and discipline was maintained through a system of punishments that any modern observer would classify, without hesitation, as institutionalized torture. Keel hauling was part of that system, and unlike so many punishments of the era, it was documented. We do not have to guess. We have ship's logs, court-martial records, ordnance texts, and, remarkably, visual evidence. The most vivid record comes from a painting, now attributed to Lief Pieters Verschoyer, a Dutch maritime artist active from the 1660s through the 1680s, a contemporary of the great Willem van de Velde. The painting, known simply as Keelhauling, shows the punishment being administered from a warship in a harbour setting, likely Rotterdam or one of the Maas estuary ports. The composition is chillingly matter-of-fact. The condemned man is visible in the water alongside the hull, the hauling rope taut, crewmen working the line. Officers watch from the quarterdeck. The crew is assembled in orderly ranks on deck. In the background, other ships at anchor, life continuing as normal. This is not a scene of chaos. This is a scene of procedure, and the painter recorded it the way he would have recorded a gun drill or a sail change, as part of the routine operation of a warship. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the largest commercial enterprise the world had ever seen, also used keel hauling aboard its ships. The VOC operated what was essentially a private navy, armed merchantmen and dedicated warships crewed by men whose legal status was closer to indentured servant than free sailor. The company's discipline codes mirrored those of the Dutch state fleet, and keel hauling appeared in them for the same categories of offence. VOC ships made voyages of 6 months or more to the East Indies, Batavia, the Spice Islands, Ceylon. The isolation was extreme. The mortality was staggering. It was not unusual for a quarter of the crew to die of disease, malnutrition, or accident on a single outward voyage. In that context, the threat of keel hauling was not just punishment, it was governance. It was the mechanism by which a commercial enterprise maintained order over thousands of desperate men on the far side of the world. But was it only the Dutch There are references, persistent but disputed, to similar practices in the ancient world. Some historians have pointed to Rhodian maritime law, one of the earliest known codes governing behavior at sea, as including provisions for dragging offenders beneath a vessel. The evidence is thin, the translations are contested, and the scholarly consensus is cautious. What is not disputed is that the impulse to use the ship itself as the instrument of punishment, to make the vessel that sustained you also the thing that destroyed you, appears to be very old. The British Royal Navy, by contrast, never formally codified keelhauling. The articles of war that governed British naval discipline from the 1650s onward listed flogging, hanging, imprisonment, and dismissal, but not keelhauling. This does not mean it never happened. Anecdotal references exist in memoirs and personal letters, and the practice was certainly known to British officers who had served alongside or fought against the Dutch. But in British service, keelhauling was unofficial, something that happened on individual ships rather than something ordered by the Admiralty. The distinction matters enormously. The Dutch did not keelhaul in secret. They keelhauled in public, in harbour, in front of the assembled crew, and sometimes in view of civilian onlookers, with the sentence read aloud and the event entered into the official record. The punishment was the spectacle. The spectacle was the point. So, what actually happened to the human body during keelhauling? This is where the history becomes medical, and where the real horror lives, not in legend, but in physics and biology. Start with the ship. A Dutch man of war of the 1650s or 1660s, a ship of the line in the first or second rate, might carry a beam of 36 to 42 feet. That is the distance from the port rail to the starboard rail at her widest point. Her keel, the massive oak timber running the full length of her bottom, sat roughly 14 to 16 feet below the waterline, depending on her draft and her cargo. The total distance a man had to travel under such a ship, from waterline on one side to waterline on the other, was approximately 50 to 60 feet in a curved path that went down across the bottom, over the keel, and back up. Now consider the hull below the waterline, a ship that had been at sea for 4 to 6 months without careening, without being hauled onto a beach and having her bottom scraped clean, carried an underwater ecosystem. Barnacles were the primary colonizers. Acorn barnacles, species including Balanus balanoides in northern waters and Balanus amphitrite in tropical, attached themselves to the hull in dense clusters and built conical shells of calcium carbonate. As they matured, the edges of these shells became sharp enough to slice skin on light contact. A 6-month growth might produce a crust 2 to 3 inches thick, each individual shell a small, rigid blade. Alongside the barnacles, mussels, oysters, tube worms, and in tropical waters, the calcareous tubes of serpulid worms, all of them hard, all of them rough, all of them covering the hull in a continuous abrasive surface. Now the procedure itself, there were 2 forms. The first, and more common, was transverse keel hauling. The victim was hauled from one side of the ship to the other, across the beam. A rope was rove through blocks at the yard arms on the port and starboard sides, passed under the hull, and attached to the victim's bound wrists. A weight, a cannonball of 24 to 32 pounds, or an iron bar, was tied to his ankles to prevent buoyancy and to ensure his body was pulled firmly against the hull surface throughout the transit. On the officer's command, the victim was pushed or thrown from the rail on one side. The crew on the opposite side hauled the rope. The victim went under, was dragged across the barnacle-encrusted bottom, over the keel timber, and up the far side. The transit time for a ship with a 40-foot beam was roughly 30 to 60 seconds, depending on how fast the crew hauled and whether they were ordered to haul slowly. The second form was longitudinal keel hauling, bow to stern. This was reserved for the most extreme offences and was, in practical terms, an execution. A ship of the line might be 150 feet long at the waterline. The transit time at hauling speed was 2 to 3 minutes, well beyond the point at which the human body can suppress the involuntary breathing reflex. Longitudinal keel-hauling victims who survived the lacerations almost invariably drowned. The physical consequences of even a single transverse keel-hauling were catastrophic. First, laceration. As the body was dragged across the barnacle crust, the skin was abraded and then torn away in strips. The back, chest, arms and face, any surface pressed against the hull, were reduced to raw, exposed tissue. Contemporary accounts, including those recorded in Dutch naval court records, describe victims surfacing with their skin, hanging in ribbons, and their flesh, laid open to the bone, in places. The salt water entering these wounds was not merely painful. It was a vector for infection that, in an era before antibiotics, was frequently fatal. Second, drowning. Even in a transverse keel hauling, the submersion time approached or exceeded the average person's breath-holding capacity, particularly under the stress of pain and panic. If the crew hauled slowly, whether by order or by the natural difficulty of dragging a weighted body through water and across a rough surface, the victim's lungs filled before he reached the other side. Third, blunt trauma. The keel itself, a heavy squared timber, often 12 to 16 inches on a side, was a blunt obstacle at the lowest point of the transit. A body being dragged across it at speed could sustain broken ribs, fractured vertebrae, dislocated shoulders, or a fractured skull. The weight on the ankles, intended to keep the body against the hull, also ensured that the impact with the keel was delivered with maximum force. Some accounts describe an additional refinement: a cannon fired into the water at the moment of submersion. The concussive shock wave was said to force the victim to exhale involuntarily, emptying the lungs and accelerating drowning. Whether this was standard protocol or occasional cruelty is difficult to determine from the surviving records. What is clear is that someone, at some point, thought of it, and that the idea was considered worth recording. The sentence could specify 1, 2, or 3 passes under the keel. 1 pass was survivable, barely. 2 was unlikely to be survived without permanent disfigurement and disability. 3 was, in all but name, a death sentence delivered in installments. Think about what that means in human terms. A man survives a keel hauling. He is hauled from the water, laid on the deck, and carried below to the surgeon. His back is a ruin of shredded skin and exposed muscle, embedded with fragments of barnacle shell that will fester in the wound for weeks. The surgeon has no anesthetic beyond rum. He has no antibiotics. He has seawater-soaked rags and a prayer. The man lies in a hammock in the dark of the orlop deck for days, weeks, listening to the same ship that nearly killed him creaking around him, the same crew that hauled the rope walking the same boards above his head. If he survives the infection, and many did not, he returns to duty on the same vessel, under the same officers, subject to the same code. The ship does not apologize. The code does not change. The barnacles grow back. And here is the fact that matters most, the fact that reframes everything. This was done by governments, by organized, professional navies operating under written codes of law approved by sovereign states. Not by pirates, not by outlaws, by the institutions that called themselves civilization. Now for the uncomfortable truth that every pirate movie, every pirate video game, and every pirate Halloween costume gets wrong. There is virtually no documented evidence that pirates use keel hauling. The punishment is almost exclusively associated with organized state navies, particularly the Dutch, and with commercial fleets like the VOC. The reason is structural. Keel hauling required something pirates generally did not have: institutional authority and procedural formality. It was a formal sentence. It required a hearing, a verdict, a crew assembled as witnesses, an officer to supervise the execution, and a log entry afterward. Pirate ships operated under articles, democratic codes signed by every crew member before the voyage began. But their justice was faster, rougher, and less theatrical. A pirate crew that wanted to punish one of its own was far more likely to maroon him on a deserted island, give him Moses' law, 39 lashes, or simply vote to put him ashore at the next port. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, and the single most important primary source for the golden age of piracy, does not mention keel hauling as a pirate practice, not once. Neither does Alexandre Exquemelin's The Buccaneers of America, written from first-hand experience among the Caribbean pirates of the 1660s and 1670s. Neither do the Admiralty trial transcripts from the mass pirate trials at Cape Coast Castle and elsewhere in the 1720s, trials that recorded pirate practices in exhaustive, often lurid detail. The silence in the historical record is deafening. And it is not because the sources are shy about pirate violence. Johnson describes marooning, torture, mutilation, and execution in graphic detail. Exquemelin describes the cruelties of Henry Morgan with unflinching specificity. If pirates had keel-hauled their victims or their own men, these authors would have recorded it. They did not, because it did not happen, or happen so rarely as to leave no trace. The association between pirates and keel-hauling is almost entirely a product of fiction. It begins with the adventure novels of the 19th century, Stevenson, Sabatini, and their imitators, and it was cemented by Hollywood in the 20th. It is a case of the most dramatic punishment being assigned to the most dramatic villains. Historical accuracy be damned, and the irony is devastating. Pirates feared keel-hauling, not because they practiced it, but because they feared capture by navies that did. The documented cruelty belonged to the uniforms, not to the black flag. And yet, in the popular imagination, keel-hauling belongs to pirates. The transfer is complete. The historical record has lost. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise references keel-hauling. Assassin's Creed 4. Black Flag includes it as a game mechanic. The television series Black Sails, which, to its credit, is more historically literate than most, depicts keel-hauling administered by pirates in graphic, visceral detail. In each case, it is pirates who wield the rope. In each case, the historical reality is inverted. The reason is narrative convenience. Pirates are the outlaws of the sea, lawless, violent, theatrical. Keel-hauling is the most theatrical punishment the sea ever produced. The marriage was inevitable, even though it was fictional, but there is a deeper reason the myth persists, and it is worth saying plainly. Attributing keel-hauling to pirates allows us to keep our navies clean. If keel-hauling belongs to pirates, to criminals, to the uncivilized, to the other, then we do not have to reckon with the fact that our own institutions used techniques that we would now classify, without hesitation, as torture. The Dutch Republic was a beacon of Enlightenment tolerance, of religious freedom, of commercial innovation. It was also a state that dragged men under the keels of its warships and entered the results in official logs. We prefer the pirate version. It is more comfortable, and it is a lie. The Dutch Navy formally abolished keel-hauling in 1853. By that point, the practice had been largely dormant for decades, overtaken by flogging, imprisonment, and eventually by emerging systems of military justice that at least gestured, however tentatively, toward the rights of the accused. The last confirmed keel-hauling in Dutch naval records dates to the late 18th century, though the exact date and ship are disputed. The abolition was quiet. There was no great reform movement, no public outcry, no pamphlet campaign. Keel-hauling was simply removed from the list of authorized punishments in a routine revision of naval regulations. It was erased by bureaucracy, not by conscience, and perhaps that is the most unsettling truth about keel-hauling. Not the barnacles, not the drowning, not the appalling physics of a human body being dragged through salt water and living limestone. It is the orderliness of it, the written codes, the formal hearings, the crew assembled in ranks, the officer with the parchment, the drummer with the slow roll, the log entry afterward, date, name, offense, sentence administered. The sea has always demanded a different kind of justice, harsher, faster, more absolute than anything conceived on land. There were no appeals at sea, no lawyers, no higher courts. A captain who could not maintain discipline was a captain who would lose his ship, and losing a ship meant losing the lives of every man aboard. The stakes were existential, and the punishments reflected that. But the men who administered those punishments were not outlaws, they were officers. They wore the uniforms of sovereign states. They served their king, or their republic, or their company. They filed reports. They drew pensions. The question keelhauling leaves behind is not whether it was cruel. Of course it was cruel. The question is whether cruelty administered by a state, logged in triplicate, and justified by the necessities of order, whether that cruelty is somehow different from the cruelty of men who flew a black flag and answered to no one. History's answer for more than 2 centuries was yes. The ocean's answer has always been no. The harbour at Rotterdam is quiet now. The warships are gone, broken up, sunk, or rotting in museum dry docks. The VOC is a memory. The article brief is a document in an archive, read by historians and no one else. The barnacles still grow. They do not care what century it is. They attach to pleasure boats and seawalls and the concrete pilings of container terminals, building their small limestone volcanoes the way they always have, patient and sharp and indifferent to everything above the waterline. But somewhere in a Dutch museum collection, Verscheyer's painting survives. A man in the water, a rope under the keel, an officer watching from the quarterdeck, a crew in silent ranks on the deck, a government doing what governments do when the law runs out and the ocean begins. And if you stand in front of it long enough, if you look past the cracked varnish and the darkened pigment and the centuries of careful restoration, you can almost hear the drums.